U.S. officials raise the possibility of working with Iran in this growing crisis. For analysis, we turn to Charles Dunne. He's a national security expert and former U.S. State Department official who worked on the Iran-Iraq desk. I spoke with him earlier from Washington, D.C. Charles, welcome to Arise America. Thank you so much for joining us. You know, the United States working with Iran is quite an unlikely pairing. I don't know that there are many more that are any more unlikely. However, what would that cooperation look like, most likely?
Well, I think it's possible that it would, first of all, take the form of consultations on what the two countries see as a political outcome in the country, at least to get together on what they see as the long-range goals. If we get past that first phase, there might be room for additional cooperation. And I think the administration hasn't really focused on what that's going to look like yet.
And I wonder just how high up the chain this will go. Who will meet with whom and where they will meet. As I understand it, there's going to be nuclear talks in Vienna this week. Might this conversation about what's happening in Iraq come up as soon as that meeting?
Yes, supposedly Deputy Secretary Bill Burns is going to be there. He may have consultations on the margin with his Iranian counterparts. I think that will be a real test of where any further cooperation on the subject of Iraq could go. If those talks prove successful, I wouldn't be a bit surprised to see Secretary Kerry reaching out to his Iranian counterpart as well.
I wonder, does this expose the United States at all in forming this alliance? And that might be too strong a word at this time, but at least cooperation in joining forces against the militants in Iraq. If this might cost the United States politically with our allies in the Middle East?
Certainly. I think the Saudis would be absolutely apoplectic if this turned out to be a real substantive cooperation between Iran and the United States to beat back Sunni militants in Iraq. The Saudis, for example, are already furious at us for taking nuclear talks as far as we've gone, for failing to take action to help overthrow Assad. And this would be something that could further turn not only Saudi Arabia, but some other Gulf states against us and looking for other options in terms of fulfilling their policies in the region.
Let's pick apart a couple of references that you just made. Let's start with Syria. Isn't there a real possibility that if for some reason the United States helps provide military equipment, provide military aid, that aid could somehow end up in the hands of the regime fighting for Assad?
Well, that's, I think, less likely a possibility than some of the arms being potentially transferred to militants whose agenda we don't agree with. But anytime you release these weapons into the wild, as it were, you are going to run a risk.
And in this case, of course, we're talking about the nuclear talks that are coming up in Vienna just this week. So how does this new alliance then complicate negotiations over Iran's nuclear program? Does it provide any leverage at all?
I think it does potentially provide some leverage for the United States. Again, potentially at the expense of some of our relationships in the Gulf states. But it is a point of discussion that could be used to kind of advance a broader agenda on nuclear issues and perhaps other political and diplomatic issues with Iran as well.
Of course, we can't talk about any type of negotiation or diplomacy without talking about Nouri al-Maliki, who in many ways is blamed for the frustration felt by the Sunnis because he seemed to be unwilling to include Sunnis in any level of influence in the government. So is there a possibility for diplomacy with al-Maliki in place?
Well, that's going to be very tricky because, of course, the Iranians are among Maliki's staunchest supporters. They have a very different agenda that the United States does. The United States would like to see inclusive, non-sectarian politics and a political deal among all the players. That is not Iran's interest at all. They want to support Maliki. They support him in his sectarian agenda. And so that is going to be very difficult for the United States to pull off.
What does this imply, this willingness that, John Kerry came out, and I'm assuming he purposely made the statement that he made that the U.S. would not rule out working with Iran. Let me just quote him and not paraphrase. He said, "I wouldn't rule out anything that would be constructive, and including presumably American airstrikes." So what does this signal in terms of U.S.-Iran relations?
I think it's really too soon to tell that this signals any major breakthrough on the U.S.-Iran front. I think it is a furthering of the administration's desire to have some kind of rapprochement with the country, and as we discussed earlier, might be useful in leveraging an Iran nuclear deal. But the United States has fallen into so many pitfalls so many times when trying to create breakthroughs with Iran, that it's very difficult to say that this is going to make a huge bit of difference. And the other thing I'd just like to point out is that there's still, bitter conflicts within the Iranian government about the necessity or usefulness of talking to the United States, let alone coming to a political deal with it. And I think this could be another very problematic situation for so-called moderates within the Iranian regime.
Yeah, I think it's going to be tricky to say the least. We'll have to leave it right there for now. Charles Dunne, thank you so much for your expertise.
My pleasure.